The borrower. Emily Carter had worked at the Hollowbrook Library for 15 years, and in all that time, she had never met a more dedicated reader than Mr. Thorne. He was an old man, tall and thin, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of candle wax and left too close to a fire. His suit was always the same, dark gray, slightly too large, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. His eyes were pale, washed out blue, the color of old ink faded on parchment. Mr. Thorne visited every week. Rain or shine, snow or sleet, he would arrive precisely at 4:06 p.m., stepping through the heavy oak doors with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who knew time better than most. He never spoke much, just a nod, a thin-lipped smile, and then he would disappear into the shelves, selecting books with an almost reverent touch. Emily had always liked him. Quiet, polite, the kind of patron a librarian dreams of. And then, one evening, she realized something strange. Mr. Thorne never returned his books. It started as a nagging thought, one she pushed aside at first. The Hollowbrook Library wasn't exactly strict about late fees, and people lost books all the time. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. She pulled up his account. The list was staggering. Decades of checkouts. Hundreds, no thousands of books. Yet not a single return recorded. Emily frowned, adjusting her glasses. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe the system had glitched. She clicked through the records, scanning the titles. They were all over the place. Fiction, non-fiction, poetry, history, philosophy. No pattern, no genre or preference. Just book after book, borrowed and never brought back. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. A cold feeling crept up her spine. This wasn't just late returns. This was something else. The next week, when Mr. Thorne came in, Emily watched him more carefully. He moved the same as always, calm, unhurried. He didn't browse, not really. He walked the aisles with a purpose, as if the books were waiting for him. She took a breath and stepped out from behind the counter. "Mr. Thorne," she said, keeping her voice light, "could I speak with you for a moment?" He paused, one hand resting on the spine of a thick, leather-bound novel. Slowly, he turned to her, those pale eyes, unreadable. "Of course, Miss Carter." She gestured toward the counter and pulled up his account. "I was just going through some records and I noticed something odd. It seems like you've checked out quite a few books over the years, but, well, none of them have been returned." A long silence stretched between them. Then he smiled, a small, tight thing. "Ah, yes. That does make sense. Emily blinked. Excuse me? He tilted his head slightly. They're not meant to be returned. The words sent a strange, crawling sensation through her stomach. What do you mean? Perhaps it would be easier to show you. He slipped the book he had been holding back onto the shelf. Would you care to visit my home, Miss Carter? The invitation was the last thing she expected. She should have said no. She didn't. Mr. Thorne lived on the outskirts of town, in an old Victorian house that leaned slightly to one side, as if exhausted by the weight of years. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass warped like the surface of a pond disturbed by unseen ripples. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something else. Something heavy. The scent of old paper, ink, and a faint metallic tang. And the books. They were everywhere, stacked on every surface, lining every wall, climbing toward the ceiling like ivy. Emily stepped closer to one of the piles, brushing her fingers along a spine. The book was blank. She opened it, heart pounding. Every page, every single page was empty. Her breath hitched. Mr. Thorne, what is this? They were red, he said simply. She turned to face him. Read? You mean erased? Is there a difference? He moved past her, running a hand along one of the shelves. Stories are fragile things, Miss Carter. They exist only so long as they are remembered. Once they are consumed, they fade. Emily's fingers tightened around the book. You're taking the words. Not I, them. She frowned. Them? Mr. Thorne exhaled, a slow, tired sound. They need to be fed. Stories, memories, thoughts. They require sustenance. A whisper threaded through the room, soft at first, then growing. Emily turned sharply. The books, the blank ones, they were whispering. The sound slithered through the air, thin and hungry. Words lost, devoured, stolen. The pages rustled, shifting as if breathing. Mr. Thorne's shoulders sagged. I have served them for a long time, Miss Carter. Too long. The whispers grew louder. But they are still hungry. The air thickened, pressing against her skin, her bones. The books trembled. The empty pages turned, faster and faster, inkless words still screaming from their depths. Emily stumbled back. I have to go. His eyes were sad. I'm afraid that's not how this works. The books shuddered. The whispers turned to voices. The voices to screams. The words had been taken. And now, they wanted more. Emily never returned to the library. The next week, a new patron arrived. A woman with tired eyes and dust on her clothes. She moved slowly, choosing her books with careful hands. She borrowed them. She never returned them. The third knock. Annie Caldwell had lived in the same house on the edge of town for as long as she could remember. It was a small, lonely place with an old oak tree out front that scratched against the window when the wind picked up. It was the kind of house that always felt colder inside than out, no matter how high she turned up the heat. It had been her mother's house before it was hers, and before that, it belonged to her grandmother, a house full of whispers and warnings. "The first knock is the wind," her mother used to say when Annie was just a child, hiding under the quilt during a storm. "The second is the living. But the third," her mother's voice would drop to a whisper then, "the third is something else, and you must never open the door." Annie had never questioned it. Some superstitions were just stitched into her bones, passed down like heirlooms. She had lived by that rule her entire life, and she had never, not once, opened the door after the third knock, until the night she did. It was late October, and the wind had been howling all evening. The kind of wind that sounded almost like voices, like someone whispering just beyond hearing. Annie sat curled up on the couch, an old book in her lap, a cup of tea, long gone cold, on the table beside her. She hadn't noticed the time until the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. And then came the first knock, a soft, hollow sound against the wood. Not unusual in a house as old as hers. The wind had a way of making things move, making the walls creak and the floors groan. She ignored it. Then came the second knock, louder this time, more deliberate. Not the wind. Annie felt her breath catch in her throat. The second knock was the living, her mother had always said. Maybe someone lost? A traveler needing shelter from the storm? It had happened before, though not in years. Still, she didn't move. And then came the third knock. It wasn't like the first two. This one rattled the door in its frame, made the floor tremble beneath her feet. It was deep, too deep, like something vast and heavy was standing on her porch, pressing its weight against the wood. It made her bones ache. Annie sat frozen, every part of her screaming not to move. She should ignore it. She should wait until it passed. That was the rule. That was the way things had always been. But something was different this time. A voice, low and familiar, drifted through the door. Annie. Her breath caught. It was her mother's voice. She hadn't heard that voice in years. Not since she stood at her mother's grave. Not since she packed away her things and let the house settle into its silence. But it was her. It had to be. "Annie, please." The voice was weak, bleeding. Her mother had never begged for anything in her life. Annie stood, her legs shaky beneath her. She took slow steps toward the door, pressing her palm flat against the wood. It was ice cold, as if something on the other side had leached all the warmth from it. "Mom?" Silence. She should turn around. She should go back to bed. She should pretend none of this had ever happened. Instead, Annie reached for the lock. It clicked open with a soft snap. The handle was cold beneath her fingers. She hesitated just for a second, then pulled the door open. There was nothing there. The porch was empty, the wind whipping dead leaves across the wooden planks. The oak tree stood motionless, its branches still against the night sky. The road beyond was deserted, just an endless stretch of black, disappearing into the distance. Annie let out a shaky breath. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe she was half asleep and dreaming. She almost laughed at herself, at the way her hands were still trembling. And then something grabbed her wrist. She didn't have time to scream. The world flipped, the porch vanishing from beneath her feet. The wind roared, deafening now. A cyclone of sound and darkness swallowing her whole. She tumbled, weightless, her body twisting through something that wasn't air, wasn't space, wasn't anything she could understand. And then, silence. When Annie opened her eyes, she was standing in front of the door again. Only it wasn't her door. The house looked the same, but different. The wood was darker, the paint older, peeling in long strips like dead skin. The porch sagged, the railings cracked and splintered. The air smelled wrong, stale, damp, like earth long buried. And then she saw it, the woman standing in the doorway. It took Annie a moment to recognize her, to see through the gaunt cheeks and hollowed eyes, through the way the skin hung loose like it didn't quite fit. But she knew. She knew those hands, those lips, those eyes staring back at her in silent horror. It was her, a version of her, twisted and wrong, standing where she had just been. "No," Annie whispered. "No, this isn't real." But the other Annie, the one in the doorway, raised a hand. Knocked once, twice, and then, on the third knock, the door swung open. Darkness rushed forward, swallowing Annie whole. And in the hat house on the edge of town, a woman named Annie Caldwell went to bed, unaware that she had ever answered the door at all.